If we want to edit the preferences for Adobe After Effects, we can go up to the Edit, and we'll find this preference selection here. And we have a list of preferences, and I'll be going over all of these. But for now, I'll just be going over the general. Here you can see that we have a number of levels of undo. 32 is the default for After Effects, because we normally don't need more than 32 levels of undo. Although we can set it up to 99, this will take up more memory for the processor in order to undo all the levels of the actions that we've done. And so 32 is usually a good amount, but if you feel that you might make a lot of mistakes, you can set it up to be higher. Or if you need the space for the memory, you can set it lower in order to account for that. We have this button, these switches. This switch here is the Show Tools Tips. And if I were to hover over one of my tools in the window, right now this preference window is the main window, so you can't really see, but if I were to hover over one of these icons, a little yellow pop-up would appear that tells me what this button is. And we can turn this on and off, and this would also be if we wanted to save a little bit of memory, but I usually keep them on just in case I forget the name of this button, or I forget what that button does, because After Effects does have a lot of buttons that within Windows, and some of the buttons are the same, and some buttons you might think are one thing and actually turn out to be another, so I usually leave this on. We can also have tabbed windows, which is how the palettes are. We can click and drag, and those tabs, and we can have separate windows or embed windows into each other. Here we have close multiple views simultaneously, and I usually leave this off even if I was working with the multiple views of a composition, because if I accidentally clicked to close one of them, I don't want to, and I didn't want to close the other windows, and if I have this selected, it'll close all of my windows. So I just usually leave this unchecked. Here we have switches affect nested comps, and this would be the switches within the actual layer of a composition. When we have a composition, we would have a number of switches, such as the enable frame blending and the turning on and off the effects, and we can use those switches in order to affect the comp, rather than having to go into the composition and change all those for each layer. We can also have this default spatial interpolation to linear, which just affects the way that motion paths are created. It's off right now, and I usually just leave the settings of After Effects at its default. Here we have the preserve constant vertex count when editing masks. What this does is it'll keep the same number of vertexes when we move the masks around, so that way we don't accidentally create new vertexes just by moving the vertexes around. And here we have synchronized time of all related items, and this is an important one to have on, as it'll keep all of our layers in time as when we use nested comps and things such as that. The expression pick whip is that little swirly key that we'll be using for expressions, and here it says that it writes in compact English. And unless you can understand the actual programming languages, it's better to keep this on. Here we have create split layers above original layer, and when we split a layer into two with another layer, this will keep both layers on top rather than to have the layer with the layer that's splitting it and then have the layer that it's split underneath it. And it just keeps it together so that it's easier to manage. And we have all these other types of properties here to allow scripts to write files, enable JavaScript debugger, and these are more advanced. Use system color picker, and we can just use this to change the way that our color picker is used from swatches. And we can also create new layers at best quality, and this will import when we drag from the project window to the timeline window. It'll be at the best quality. If not, it'll just be at the not the worst quality, but the standard quality, and we would have to change the switch in the actual timeline window. You'll notice in my preference menu that I have this little pull down bar, and from here I can get to any of my other preferences that I can reach in my edit preference menu. Here I'm going to go over the previews. Here you can see our fast preview, and this is our standard preview. We can select have adaptive resolution, and what this does is it'll change the resolution of the images in the composition while they're being played. So if the computer's processing power isn't strong enough to use the image at its full resolution, it'll degrade the resolution up to a point. That way it can continue to try to reach a normal level of animation. And here we can enable the OpenGL and the adaptive resolution when OpenGL is enabled. We also have our OpenGL information here, which, if you know how to work with this, will be we can change it for more accurate and faster, depending on how we want it to appear in the timeline or in the composition window. We can also select our audio preview, and we can select how long the preview will be, what sampling rate, and its size and channels. And these are the settings that we can also set in our output for render. Now I'm going to go on to display, and you can see here in our display we can select from a number of properties for the motion path. We can select to have the motion path, the complete motion path, or I mean no motion path at all. We can have to select to have all of the keyframes for the motion path, and that would show us all of the entire motion path. Here we can select to have, here it says 5 keyframes, but we can select a different number of keyframes, and it'll show us the motion path along those keyframes. Or as it says here, for 15 seconds, and this is what we have it set to. For 15 seconds of the timeline window, we would be able to see the motion path along that amount of time. And this would actually be split in two, because we would have the amount of time that goes forward in time and the amount of time that goes backwards for the motion path. And the same goes for the number of keyframes. We can also disable the thumbnails in the project window, and we can auto zoom when the resolution changes, and we can show the rendering in progress. So when we click the render, it'll appear here in the composition window while it's rendering out, and we can see each frame as it renders. This here also determines the size of the height for a timeline. So for each of the layers that comes in, we have it at 4 cells, and we can change this in order to gain a different size.